The principal dead horse at the top of the menu is NATO, which continues to be treated as this sacrosanct holy relic. And frankly speaking, internally, it's in complete disarray. It's falling apart. And Americans, I think, sense it, and it's falling apart for all the obvious reasons. You've got economic problems in Europe compounded by all the sanctions imposed on Russia. And while our sanctions have no doubt had some impact, let's be frank, the blowback from the sanctions we've imposed on our European allies has been horrific. And now the Russians have simply announced that they will stop exporting any oil or gas to Germany until further notice. I think that's going to hit a lot of other Europeans. There are problems inside NATO. The Italians were trying to help the Germans with oil and gas, and they too are in a difficult position. And as a result, Draghi has been under severe criticism and is probably going to be forced out. Macron is always been on thin ice, and I think more so now than ever. The problem is that the European peoples are suffering. They're overwhelmed with the immigration problem. We've got 900,000 more Ukrainians pouring in on top of millions of Muslims. Criminality is out of control, and it's not being reported in the press, but the people that live there know what's happening. And there's a sense that why Russia? If you're an Italian or a German and you look at Russia, you say, well, wait a minute. I don't see Russia as evil incarnate, and it doesn't pose a threat to me. And of course, they're right.
So what does President Biden and what do the internationalists around him, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, and his colleagues in the foreign ministries in Europe, what do they really want NATO to do? I mean, do they want to see NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine or, God forbid, in Poland or Estonia fighting Russian troops because they see this as a means to either degrade the Russian military or get rid of Putin once and for all?
Well, very quick answer on the first one. No one in Europe is interested in committing its forces to a fight with the Russians. They don't see any reason for it. Most of what we call military establishments in Europe are gestures. They're facades. Most of these forces haven't seen any real action against anybody for decades, and they're certainly not up to taking on the Russian military. I mean, remember, the Russian military was this hopelessly inept, incompetent organization that has now withstood 150 days of continuous fighting and crushed the Ukrainian military establishment virtually out of existence, to the point where the Ukrainian government's going to have a tough time just surviving, especially if we stop funding it, which is what we're effectively doing. We've made Ukraine the 51st state. So, no, that first part is nobody wants anything to do with this war, and they know they're not prepared to fight it. As for the rest of it, I think they have went along with Biden's notion that somehow or another this would force Mr. Putin to resign and create a catastrophe in Russia. And they believed it. And now they've gotten an education. Russia has an abundance of resources. It's probably the country in the world that is richest in resources. It's not going to go out of business. And Mr. Putin's popularity ratings are through the roof in Russia. All the Russians see him as defending Russia.
Does there come a time when the American government recognizes that the sanctions were a disaster, that they're hurting American business enterprises? They're not at all deterring Putin. All these Russian oligarchs' yachts that were seized, that was just for show. Yeah. Is there a time when Tony Blinken and company realize we're on the wrong track and we got to get out of this?
I think privately they recognize that they are very much on the wrong track. I think they are taking alarmist phone calls from everywhere, from Stockholm to Berlin to Rome, Paris, Madrid. So I think they know that. The problem is they have no plan B. There was never any serious thought given to this whole process. In other words, what was the objective to begin with? No one had a stated objective except to build up the Ukrainian military to not only present a threat to Russia, but to potentially recapture Crimea and harm the Russian military. Well, this is fanciful nonsense that never made any sense. So there is no plan B. So I think they're going to do what you would expect these ideologues to do, which is double down on what they're already doing and then hope against hope that they can outlast this. And I'm not sure
Right.
that they can. I mean, my recommendation, frankly, is send Nancy Pelosi to Kiev and let her sort it out and just leave her there until it's fixed.
She's threatening to go to all places, to Taiwan. And of course, Beijing is not very happy about that. And they're threatening some severe response to that. We'll talk about Nancy later. Tell me about the actual war. I mean, you don't see it on television anymore. You don't even see it on the front pages of the New York Times. So a couple of questions. Are the Ukrainians holding any ground? Have they won back any ground from the Russians?
No.
Have they actually used American military hardware to attack Russian hardware that is already inside Ukraine? So they're part of Ukraine is bombing another part of Ukraine. And where does Zelensky stand in his stability as the head of the Ukrainian government?
Well, as you know, Zelensky now fired Bakhanov and several other people that were in charge of the security services.
Very senior people.
Yeah, it looks like the last days of Pompeii. The volcano has erupted, and now he's looking for people to blame for the lava flows that are pouring through the streets. So I think that's part of the problem. I don't think Zelensky is really in charge of a great deal anymore. He's got a force out there. The nationalists are trying to control what's left of it. They're rounding up deserters and either shooting them or forcing them back into action. But the truth is the Ukrainian forces are defeated. They can't regain what's lost. Most of the Russian army has been withdrawn, Judge. I'm talking about the combat force. They have been resting and refitting for the last few weeks. And the fighting in Donbass, which was always the critical portion of this operation, because that's where the Ukrainian forces were located, has been done by Chechen forces, separatist forces that have taken heavy casualties, and mercenaries. Those are the ones backed by massive Russian artillery, regular army artillery, but the regular army combat force that we saw at the beginning, that's been resting and refitting. And I think they're preparing for a massive offensive to finish off this war once and for all. And again, Putin is not interested in crossing the Dnieper River and going into Western Ukraine. But I think he will roll up to the Dnieper to a certain point, and then I think he still wants to gain control of Kharkov and Odessa.
All right, but as you point out in your piece, Worshipping Dead Horses, Putin cannot tolerate a free and independent Ukraine, much less a Ukraine that's a member of NATO, because that's a permanent 24/7 threat to Moscow. Am I right?
Well,
have I grasped properly what you wrote in this piece?
Well, not completely. I mean, it can be free and independent as far as he's concerned. It cannot be a puppet of the West. It can't be a platform for attack against him.
Or if it's a member of NATO, he views it as a puppet for the West.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, privately, he's told many people he doesn't care if Ukraine's part of the European Union, could care less. His concern from the very beginning was this massive NATO-trained and equipped army funded largely by us. That's no longer in the picture. But what I'm concerned about, what many Europeans privately are concerned about, I know Berlin is very much so. And remember, Berlin is still the elephant in the room economically. And right next to Berlin is a somewhat smaller elephant called Italy. Both of these states are concerned that what will happen is that we will go back into Ukraine in a subversive way and try to continue to use the Ukrainian people and the rump Ukrainian state as an opportunity to attack and threaten Russia. That's what he doesn't want. And that's what Berlin and Rome don't want. No European wants that. That means literally in our lifetimes, perpetual war, to the point where finally Putin decides, I don't want to go there. I don't want a border with NATO. Remember, that's one of the things he doesn't want. He doesn't want a border with NATO. He's already got a small one way up north in Estonia. He doesn't want it. So if he can't live with the situation because we make it impossible, well, then, you're forcing his hand again. I think it's time for this to end, and I think the Russians are going to try to do that over the next 30 days.
What are U.S. intelligence, senior members of the intelligence community advising the president? If you know, are they telling him what they think he wants to hear? Or are they telling him what you've just described? that this is a lost cause. It's over with. You better get the hell out and get out now.
Judge, the thing for all of your viewers to keep in mind is that presidents always get the intelligence they want.
Even if it's not truthful.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Because we've lost our sense of proportionality. If you think that you are invulnerable, invincible, and more powerful than everyone else, then you think you can afford to ignore things like the truth when it suits you. This has gotten us into a lot of trouble now, I think, with Russia, because Russia is not Iraq. Russia is not Afghanistan. It's not Libya. And, we're talking now, I listened to the former Secretary of State Pompeo essentially describe the apocalypse, the unification of Russia, China, and Tehran into one iron alliance that we should then set out to crush. I mean, this is the sort of madness that is rampant in Washington, and it presupposes that we are more than we are. In other words, we are not the nation, Judge, as you know, that we were in 1991. Right. 30 years ago, we were a very different country than the country today. And there doesn't seem to be any willingness to admit that and figure out that we've got serious problems here that need our attention. By the way, that's true for Western Europe.
One of the problems that you point out in your piece, Worshipping Dead Horses, you sort of pivot from explaining the uselessness and weakness of NATO into serious problems with the American military, which have been visited upon it by the attitude of current leadership, the Biden administration, with respect to promoting people on the basis of race and gender who are not the most qualified, and establishing the sort of woke atmosphere in the military that people like you and I and people watching us today laugh at when we see happening on college campuses. Now you're telling me and telling your readers that this is happening in the U.S. military. Have they considered the long-term effect of this nonsense?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think they have, and I don't think they understand just how debilitating it is. On the one hand, you have a president who is more warlike, frankly, more aggressive, more bellicose than any president I can remember in my lifetime when he talks about Russia. Not China, but Russia.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
George W. was bellicose, but not with respect to Russia.
Never. Absolutely not. And the key thing here is that while we have all this bellicosity on one side, we're systematically devastating the armed forces on the other side.
Tell us how the armed forces are being systematically devastated.
Well, imagine
American armed forces.
Imagine you have a group of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, doesn't matter, but I would think certainly soldiers and Marines, and you announce that the commander has been removed and you have a new commander. Your new commander is Tiny Tim, with the ukulele in the flowered shirt and the long hair.
Right, this is crazy.
Kind of a uniform on, but
this is crazy, Colonel.
Yeah, but that's essentially what you've got, and says, look, Tiny Tim is one of the finest people we've ever met. And by the way, he's transgender, but you've got to take showers with him because he deserves the opportunity to take showers with you, even though he's transgender. And he may not wear a skirt all the time, but he's wearing one today. You have to tolerate all of this. This is important, and this is what makes us free. This is what we're talking about with diversity. And then the other thing is, I'm sorry, you're not a woman. You're not black. You're something else. You may be white. You may be, Asian, Northeast Asian. We're not interested in you. We don't care how well you have performed. We don't care how many years you've served. We don't care about your performance under fire in combat. We're interested in Sheila over here and moving her forward because we want a new force that is radically different from the one you're in.
All right. When the government, and I realize there's some metaphors and exaggerations in there, but it's largely a summary of what's been happening. When the government does that, does it think in the long term, we don't use a draft anymore. We really need volunteers. We need thousands of volunteers every year. And our base for volunteers are young, virile men who really don't care about woke and don't want wokeness imposed on them, whether the young men are white or black or Hispanic or brown or whatever they may be. My point is, does the Biden administration leadership in the Pentagon recognize that imposing wokeness on the military will have a catastrophic effect on recruiting in the long term?
I think they've already seen it. We're already confronting this catastrophic impact on recruiting. We can't recruit the people that we want. And their attitude is it doesn't make any difference. We'll just drop the standards. We'll start recruiting people that we normally never take into the armed forces, people that are far below the desired IQ levels, people that have criminal records, people that may have serious problems, drug problems or something else. This is already happening. So again, I think they view it as none of these things matter anymore. We live in the era of push button warfare. Fire a missile. We're still the biggest, most powerful, richest country in the world. We can do pretty much as we want. And the important thing in the backs of their minds is that we're building a force that reflects our leftist ideology and values. And we're replacing the values that were historically motivating inside the armed forces with our new values.
One of my viewers just texted us, who wants to die for Biden and Zelensky. It's just so appealing. I mean, no American wants to do that. Does Tony Blinken, does Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, do they think American troops want to die either for wokeness or for Zelensky?
Lloyd Austin is a mystery to me. I've never met the man. And looking back on the years that he served, he certainly was an enormously, let's put it this way, he benefited enormously from the system that we have in place, right. Affirmative action and other things. And yet he's turned on the institution and seems to be turning on the American people and the country with incredible hatred and distaste. It's hard for me to fathom and imagine. It's even more difficult for me to look at senior officers who stand around and act as though this is perfectly normal. And when you say, what the hell are you doing? Their answer is, well, I've got orders. Wow. Orders to do what? Destroy the force?
Right.
Ruin morale, destroy cohesion, destroy discipline. We don't even have the authority today in the chain of command that we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago to take action when it's required.
What is the level of wokeness? It's hard for me to ask this with a straight face in the Russian army.
Yeah, that's a great question. The last time I looked at a recruiting video, I'd say about zero. Everybody there understands the Russian army exists to kill enemies of the Russian state. And all the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines understand that's their number one task. We go to where we're ordered and we defend the country and we kill the enemies of the state.
All right. We're now at the end of July. Where will we be by Labor Day in the war in Ukraine?
I'd be
still sending billions of dollars in cash and material there, or recognizing the folly of what we've done?
I'm glad you brought that up because most Americans don't understand, Judge. If you look at this $40 billion package that we passed back in May, almost universally, right. Only about half of that is for military assistance. It's still $20 billion, but it's enormous.
What's the other half?
Well, the other half it's unclear. It goes into aid and assistance that we would term nation building, support the Ukrainian state, humanitarian assistance, medical support, and so forth for the war. But most of the money for military equipment and military assistance really doesn't leave the United States. And this is what most people don't understand. When we say we're going to give the Ukrainians, for discussion purposes, let's just say 100 artillery pieces, we turn to the Department of Defense and say, send 100 artillery pieces to Ukraine. And they say, yes, sir. Then we send money over to the Pentagon to pay for the 100 artillery systems that we've taken and shipped. They then take that amount of money, whatever it is, for those artillery systems, and they turn and give it to the defense industries and say, give us replacements.
Right.
So it's kind of a circular system, because at the same time, remember, when all this money moves from Capitol Hill to DOD to the military industrial complex that we know as the defense industries, that money also involves donations for people on the Hill. That money involves making constituents happy, providing them with employment and jobs and so forth.
Which might explain why the Congress voted actually to give more money than Uncle Joe asked them for, because they're all looking for their next contribution. The late, great Justice Scalia used to say, it doesn't matter why members of Congress say they voted for anything. They only vote for anything for one reason, and one reason only: to get reelected.
Yeah, and that involves a lot of money.
The equipment that's on its way there, or that's there, this is not brand new, just built in North Carolina stuff, is it? Is this stuff that's been surplus, sitting in Warsaw or in a warehouse somewhere outside of Warsaw?
It's a mix. You know, some old things have been sent, but a lot of this is relatively new equipment. Remember, we're also depleting our ammunition stocks. So you've got to replace those ammunition stocks. When you talk about missiles, we've been saying the Russians are going to run out of missiles. Miracle of miracles, they've never run out. But that's because, for instance, if you shoot at an incoming ballistic missile, you have a Patriot missile battery, you're shooting 2 missiles for every one that is shot at you.
Right.
Well, that implies an enormous surplus of missiles on hand in peacetime. Well, we don't have that. In fact, we need a much larger surplus of those weapon systems.
General,
so the bottom line is no. And then the other thing to keep in mind, Judge, and I'm glad you mentioned this, we have been trying to get control of where both money and equipment is going in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have not been helping us. And what we continue to hear about is enormous graft and corruption.
Yeah.
And the Russians, of course, are not stupid. They know what happens in eastern Ukraine. They know the country. They've been together for hundreds of years. So anything that's really new, like HIMARS that comes in, once it shoots or fires, it's a target. Yeah, I think we have the testimony in a public forum of a Ukrainian official essentially telling us that he was assassinated because he was part of the negotiating team back in March and April, and appeared to be, in their view, a Russian collaborator. Because, as he points out, that the team went there with no intention whatsoever of negotiating for peace. They were interested in simply dragging things out to buy time for Ukrainian forces to fight the Russians.
Well, are these rogue negotiators that are interacting with the Russian government on their own, or are these people that were dispatched by President Zelensky?
No, well, they were sent by Zelensky. And, then the whole thing, as you know, was subsequently suspended in Istanbul. And they dropped the pretense of being serious about negotiating a solution. But this man was identified early on and then essentially shot and killed on the grounds that he was a Russian collaborator. Now, I don't necessarily think he was. There are a lot of people in Ukraine who have been accused of this sort of thing simply because they opened their mouths and suggested that a peaceful solution was desirable.
Have there been, or has there been, the resignation or the firing of late of people around President Zelensky in his cabinet and in his personal staff? And if so, what's behind that?
Well, someone who had worked in the defense ministry for Zelensky, was in the cabinet, resigned in the middle of the allegations of corruption. Surprise, surprise. There was also an allegation that I don't know if it was he and his family, but another cabinet member who had vacationed somewhere in the Mediterranean, or no, I guess it was actually Florida, somebody said, while the war was going on, which of course was bad form given the desperate straits that the Ukrainians face. He seems to have resigned. You had this man, Arestovich, who was the spinmeister or public affairs officer, media spokesman, defense ministry employee, who suddenly up and resigned, and then subsequently spoke and said he doubted seriously that the Ukrainians could ever win this war with Russia and wondered whether or not it might actually survive the war. And then suddenly he, surprise, surprise, was blocked. And nothing further has been heard from him, though as far as we know, he has not yet been killed.
I would imagine he has a big target on his back, a former government spokesman who resigns and says we're going to lose.
I think it's probably a good thing he takes the heat off the rest of us who are on the death list.
I know they're after you, Colonel, because I've seen that stuff. I haven't gotten word that they're after me, but I trust if you hear that, you'll give me a heads up.
Well, if I'm still around, I will. Absolutely. If I suddenly disappear, you don't need any further confirmation.
All right, let's talk about the wish of President Zelensky and his military commander for tanks and the absurd footsie that the Americans seem to be playing with the Germans over the tanks. Everybody wants these German tanks, and Joe Biden's getting in the middle of it. Do they know what the hell they're doing?
Well, I think it's pretty clear they don't. In fact, I think this is an important theme that we should address because the mood in Washington has very definitely changed. The attitude of the Washington community, and that I'm talking about those people that are the leading senators, members of the House, cabinet officers, president, vice president. The mood of these people has clearly changed. I think they're sensing that this is a lost cause, that Ukraine is very definitely going to lose. And they're trying to figure out how do we prolong the suffering? How do we prolong this fighting? They'll say publicly it's for the purpose of, quote unquote, harming Russia, which has been a complete fiasco and a disaster because Russia, frankly, has not been harmed very much. Not at all, I would say, in substantive terms, economically, financially, otherwise. But I think that's part of it. The second thing is that they're now really goading the Europeans, the Germans in particular, into committing acts that, frankly, can be regarded legally anywhere in the world as acts of war against Russia. And I think the German government is sitting there saying, do we really want to supply heavy military equipment, tanks, artillery, all these things in great quantities to this war zone to help these Ukrainians fight the Russians? Are we not, in fact, becoming co-belligerents? Now, you and I have talked before about this.
Yes.
I don't think there's any doubt about it. We are co-belligerents, but I think the Germans are now interested in putting the brakes on that. So Scholz put us in a difficult position because his representative at Ramstein last week at the conference for donors and allies that were willing to send things to Russia said that the only way the Germans would send any tanks, Leopard tanks, was if we sent M1s. Then we went through a series of comments from people in the Department of Defense, like this Mr. Colin Kahl, Assistant Secretary of Defense in OSD, who said, well, the M1 is a gas guzzler, and it has extreme maintenance requirements. It's too complex for the Ukrainians. It won't help them. The Leopard's easier for them to use, and the Leopard would be better.
Now, you have agreed with that, haven't you?
Oh, well, I agree with it, but not for the reasons that Mr. Kahl said. I mean, we've known for 30 years that the gas turbine engine's a catastrophe, both for reasons of fuel usage, but also because of the intake of all the dirt and sand and nonsense on the ground. This is an engine designed for the use of a jet at 15,000 feet, not for use on the ground. So here we have this turbine engine that's supposed to power this tank up and send it at 50 or 60 miles an hour towards the enemy. The problem is that historically, that's not necessarily what you need from the tank. I mean, tank doesn't have to go 50 or 60 miles an hour. We don't need to cover all that ground again. But the bottom line is that the M1's got a lot of problems. There's no question about it. I don't think people wanted to see this employed for the fear that they would be embarrassed by its performance. Not the gun, not the crew, but the tank as a whole for the reasons we mentioned. So now the tables have turned. In order to get the Germans to send tanks, apparently President Biden said, well, we'll send 10 M1s. And Mr. Scholz responded by saying, well, fine, then we'll send 10 Leopards. Now, this seems childish and stupid, but I think we need to understand what's really happening. Number one, people have no faith in Ukraine's ability to win this war. We have been lying about what's happening in Ukraine between the Russian and Ukrainian forces for months. We have been exaggerating Russian losses exaggerating Russian problems and minimizing and obviating Ukrainian problems and losses. The truth is seeping out. You can't conceal it much longer. So the first thing is they know they can't win. In other words, we're losing the proxy war. Our proxy can't win it. Secondly, the Europeans are concluding that this is dangerous. You know, how far out do we stick our necks? And they don't have the military industrial power to rapidly produce anything. And I think this is enormously important. The lead time, for instance, for the AMRAAM missile, which is a very important weapon that's used in the F-15, the F-22, the F-35, and by NASAMS, this, brilliant, what I would call it, brilliant air defense system that we and the Norwegians have put together with Kongsberg. It's excellent for shooting down cruise missiles, helicopters, so forth. The problem is that from the moment you ask for a missile, the wait time until you get it is 32 months.
Oh.
That's how long it takes to produce these things. When you look at all of the missiles that we're promising the Ukrainians and the systems, they're not going to arrive in any short period of time. Now, the Germans are talking about giving the Ukrainians air defense systems like the Patriot, and they'll probably provide them with some missiles. But you'll go through those missiles very rapidly, and you just can't replace them. So the Europeans and we do not have the surge capacity to fight a major war. We just don't have it. The Russians do. Their factories are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Contrary to popular belief, they're not running out of anything. They've got more of what they need than they've ever had. So all of this is dangerous. That's what we're learning from the Europeans now in private.
You stated at the outset of this last statement you made that you have sensed from public sources, and I guess from the people with whom you communicate regularly, a change in attitude on the part of decision makers in Washington. Now, I would imagine that what you have sensed is below the radar, and it hasn't yet bubbled up into the public consciousness.
No.
I mean, maybe Joe Biden's a bad example, but a hawk like Lindsey Graham, you're not going to hear him saying tomorrow the Russians are going to win and we ought to get the hell out of there, even though he may be whispering that to your friends and colleagues in D.C.
Well, see, that's an important point because I don't think they're whispering that. See, this is the great danger that we face right now. A couple of historians contacted me and they insisted they talk to me. And they walked me through all of the things that FDR did as president in the 1930s to effectively goad the Japanese into attacking our forces in the Pacific.
Right.
And we all knew, I mean, contrary to popular belief, the Navy, the Army, Marshall, the CNO of the Navy, Stark, all these people knew that the Japanese could, in fact, attack and destroy Pearl Harbor. And in the run-up to the war, FDR did several things. He put out something called the McCullum Memorandum and directed the Navy to deliberately violate Japanese home waters.
Yes.
And they did it with warships again and again and again. And he was told by the CNO, we could lose some ships. He said 2 or 3 ships is okay if we have to lose that. I mean, this is incomprehensible today, but that's what he said. And ultimately, they told him what the implications were, and he said, continue to do it. Ultimately, we know what happens. He leaves the fleet deliberately in 1941 in June in Pearl Harbor. He does not return the fleet to San Diego and San Francisco, where normally in Puget Sound, that's where the fleet in the Pacific was quartered, not in Hawaii. And the CNO said, Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. President, we're targets.
We're sitting ducks.
We could lose the fleet. Ultimately, you know the rest of the story. He deliberately did this. There are a lot of other things. He was sending as many bombers as he could to China, to Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers at the time. He wanted to build up an air force there that could firebomb Japan from China. This is in 1939, 40, 41. We don't talk about any of these things. And what they said is what is happening right now looks an awful lot like what FDR did. Now, I personally don't think that that's on President Biden's mind. But then again, I'm not sure President Biden is much more than the man who reads the script that's handed to him.
All right,
I don't know what the people behind him are up to, but if you look at what we're pushing, this is what brings you to the next point. The Ukrainians are going to face this onslaught. They have already said they can't withstand it. They're going to collapse. It's already beginning, and the Russians haven't even attacked in strength. What do we do then? Do we play this game of Polish forces, American forces, Romanian forces, whatever else we can get, and push some distance into Western Ukraine? Do we then play to confrontation?
I want to play the Russian side of this from Foreign Minister Lavrov 2 days ago in South Africa. Gary?
Мы говорим о том, что там происходит на Украине. Мы говорим о том, что эта война, она уже почти не гибридная, а почти настоящая, которую Запад долго готовил против России, стремясь уничтожить все русское от языка до культуры, что было на Украине столетиями, и запрещая людям говорить на...
Fair to say that he's speaking what President Putin thinks.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think not just President Putin, I think the majority of Russians. And it's a fair assessment based upon the things that we've been seeing over the last several years, unfortunately.
But this is a direct accusation by the internationally recognized foreign minister of Russia, pointing a finger at Washington, D.C. and the West as the prime motivators for this war. And then he uses this odd phrase, which you and I have discussed off air. He said, it's not a hybrid war, it's a war. What does he mean by hybrid war? What does this phrase mean?
This particular term was coined or invented by a former Marine major named Frank Hoffman. Very nice fellow. And I think it was really designed to somehow or another give the Marines justification for lots of Marine infantrymen to fight in future insurgencies. And what he was trying to talk about was today, hybrid war consists of men with rifles on the ground, media, external factors, other players in the international arena, game-changing weapons, all of this, instead of what we normally think of war as a more conventional confrontation with armies and air forces and so forth. And what Lavrov said, let's throw this hybrid nonsense out. We're talking about a real war. He's talking about high-end conventional warfare. It's not talking about nuclear warfare, but high-end conventional warfare. That's everything up to, but not including nuclear weapons. And he's saying this is being planned against us. That's a fair conclusion on his part based upon what you see us doing, trying desperately to provide enough support to the Ukrainians. Remember, our support goes beyond technology, goes beyond weapon systems and ammunition. It's information warfare. You know, we control the information highways. We are proselytizing for war against Russia. We are depicting Russia as this evil state, this nationalist state that rests on the foundation of Russian Orthodox Christianity. It protects its borders. It has an identity. Ergo, it must be destroyed. It must become like Western Europe and the United States, a country without borders, a country with identities that are being washed away in seas of illegal human trafficking, drug abuse, and so forth. That's what's at stake in their minds, and it's not an unreasonable assumption based upon what we're seeing. And he's saying, look, we're going to fight. And that's what we need to understand. They're not kidding, and we're not prepared for an all-out war. But
are the people in Washington who now are manifesting a change in mind aware of the defiance and forcefulness with which these kinds of statements out of the mouth of Mr. Lavrov have been made? And are they prepared to counter it by sitting down and talking to him? Do they think they're going to counter it militarily? And do they not realize that that's World War III if they do?
Well, first of all, I think it's very clear that under no circumstances are they going to hold talks with the Russians, because that would suggest that they've made a mistake.
Right. It would suggest that we're pulling the Zelensky strings, which of course we are.
Yeah. So it's not, I don't see us doing that. You know, I was asked the other day by a journalist, what do you think we should do? I said, hold talks immediately without preconditions. We need to come to some sort of resolution no matter what. That in fact, was essentially what Kissinger said a few months ago, and then, of course, changed his tune. We're not going to do that. That's an admission of failure. No one in Washington ever admits that they failed at anything. Everything's a success, no matter how many times you fail. That's the first problem. I think the second problem is there's a lot of arrogance and self-delusion. I don't think the people on the Hill really understand what war means anymore. I mean, for many, many years, we had lots of interesting people on the Hill. Sam Nunn was a good example, but there were many others. Most of them had served in the military. A lot of them lived through the Second World War. They understood what you meant when you started talking about war. So when it came to Russia, or in those days, the Soviet Union, people made it very clear that's not what we want. Whatever we do, we must find a way around that because we all know what that means. And they weren't necessarily saying it would be nuclear, but it would be so destructive and self-defeating, we don't want to engage in it. I don't sense that anymore.
What is your understanding of the latest numbers of military killed? Ukraine, Russia.
Well, Judge, first of all, this goes back to the fiction that we've been spinning about the war. We haven't told the truth about Ukrainian losses. It's becoming harder and harder to accept. We know from obituaries, we know from people on the ground in the hospitals treating the wounded. We know from the Ukrainians themselves who are posting things, comments on Telegram and sending videos. Ukrainians have lost easily 122,000, with absolute certainty, men killed on the battlefield. Secondly, they've admitted to roughly 35,000 missing in action, presumed dead. And if you go back to World War II and you look at German fatalities, there were almost 2 million casualties or dead, frankly, from the Second World War in Eastern Europe and the German Wehrmacht. And a substantial chunk of that, hundreds of thousands, were missing in action, presumed dead. They were never recovered. We have to understand that the majority of casualties being inflicted on the Ukrainians is a consequence of artillery fire, not just hard shell artillery, rocket fire, firing thermobaric warheads. These are the fuel air explosives that utterly destroy a whole area. This is how you avoid going into buildings where there may be people waiting for you. You fire a thermobaric warhead into the building, it eliminates the oxygen. It's destructive, but it kills everything because there's nothing to breathe. You have a whole range of these kinds of explosives. The Russians have great quantities of them. They use them very effectively because they are also linking these in real time to overhead surveillance. This is surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence platforms. So you're getting within seconds sometimes, certainly within a minute or two, accurate data to the artillery systems that can then fire. Keep in mind that the Russians can fire up to roughly 60,000 rounds a day. The Ukrainians are lucky to get off 6,000 or 7,000 rounds a day. In other words, tenfold more than the Ukrainians can fire in response.
Can you address you've indicated 122,000 dead, 35,000 unaccounted for, probably dead Ukrainian. What do your sources tell you is the number of dead or missing and unaccounted for on the Russian side?
What we're getting from the Russians, as well as from some the Ukrainian sources, are just, unfortunately, when it comes to the Russians, they're just not believable. But we are hearing from people on the battlefield, depending upon where you are and who you talk to. The Russians have had somewhere between 16,000, 17,000 and 25,000 killed, and perhaps another 25, 30, 40,000 wounded. And people say, well, how could that be? I just explained it to you. You have overmatch in firepower on a dramatic scale, on a strategic scale. That's why.
When will the globalists in Western Europe and in the State Department and the Defense Department come to the same realization that the political class in Washington has begun to achieve, that this is a losing fight and we have to change the mission?
Thus far, I haven't seen any evidence that there's any recognition of this. In fact, I continue to hear these disturbing comments that, well, if the Ukrainians have to fall back to the Polish border, then we'll fight a perpetual war against the Russians.
So this crazy president of Poland is going to send 100,000 Polish troops east over the border and is going to beg Joe Biden to let the 101st Airborne join them?
Well, I don't think he has to beg. I think there are lots of people that would push for that. And remember, you've got at least the equivalent of 3 armor brigades from the United States on the ground in Poland and down in Romania, plus the 101st, plus other units, formations, artillery, and so forth. Then you have the Poles, as you point out, they've now mobilized at least 200,000. They're trying to build up a force of over 300,000. That would probably support the projection of somewhere between 60 and 100,000 troops on the ground. I don't know about the Romanian side, but I know that there are elections scheduled in Poland for the fall. I don't know exactly how the government thinks. But the Polish population, and this is very important. We also discussed this map of Europe that shows the various polling data. And what you get all across Europe from the publics is a very definite preference for a negotiated solution to this war as soon as possible. There is no evidence that anybody in Europe wants to go to war with Russia. And I'm beginning to see that happen in Poland, where more and more Poles are saying, wait a minute. We're literally on the edge of the abyss here. If this war spreads, we will be destroyed.
Doesn't the German public want inexpensive Russian natural gas back in their homes to heat them for the winter?
I'm sure some do, but not yet. I think there's this belief that somehow or another they can get past this tough winter and be ready next year with their alternative energy sources. This climate change business is more than a program. It's a religious faith in much of Europe, and particularly with the Germans and Scandinavians. It's quite strange. And real data don't make any difference anymore. Again, everything connected with this war is emotion.
All right. I'm going to assume, or I want you to assume, that everything you've just educated us on is known by Russian intel and is known by President Putin. Does he come in with this slam bang invasion of 300 to 500,000 soldiers and finish everything off, or does he let the Ukrainians just sort of die on the vine?
I think he knows that he can't do the latter, because we will constantly try to resuscitate the corpse, no matter how bad it gets. We will rush in there, put it back on life support, try to get it back up on its feet and fight. I think he knows that the only way to rid Ukraine of this Ukrainian armed force is to go in and destroy it, and ultimately to replace his regime with something else, or wait for something else to emerge. I don't think he feels anymore, or for that matter, any of the Russians, they can trust anything we say. They know they can no longer trust the Europeans. They used to trust the Germans, and they actually, I think, believed Macron at one point in time. Now they know they can't trust anybody. I don't see great enthusiasm for a long and destructive war in Ukraine. Why would they be enthusiastic about that? Why do they want to kill other Slavic Orthodox Christians? I don't think they do. But the point is, they don't have much choice. And I think they will press ahead. The question is when. And I told you, I thought that the major offensives would begin sometime between the 21st of January and the 7th of February. We'll see if I'm right. There are others that say, oh, no, they're going to wait until March.